Hey, this is Governor Burgum. Thanks for doing the job, man. We appreciate it. Both come from oil and gas producing states. One of my top priorities has been to use federal state revenue sharing on oil and gas lands to help rebuild Louisiana's coastline. During the time of this hearing, we will have lost several football fields worth of Louisiana coastline, which of course makes us more vulnerable to a hurricane hitting our coast. And last Congress, I'm pleased to say that the RISE Act, which did that, passed by voice vote out of this committee. So I'm hoping we do that again. Can you briefly speak to the importance of revenue sharing to North Dakota, knowing that on federal lands in North Dakota, there's revenue that comes back to help mitigate whatever negative impact that drilling may have?
Well, yes, absolutely. And the federal revenue goes two ways. I mean, at least we've got it coming back, a portion of it back to the state, but then a portion of it goes back to the federal Treasury. And the federal Treasury, as we know, we've talked earlier about the debt that we have. Responsible, sustainable, smart development, whether it's onshore or offshore, is of great benefit to conservation, in your case, coastline, but it also can help pay for other things. In our state, the revenues that are coming in are helping pay for education, healthcare, roads. It touches every...
If you will, it's kind of a middle class, if you will, and lower economic class benefit program, because those things are touching services directly, aside from the jobs being created, directly impacting the quality of their life.
Absolutely, and then when done effectively and appropriately, it also lowers the burden of sales tax and property tax and income tax on those same hardworking individuals.
It's music to my ears. I will say, when I speak to the folks that actually do these big developments, one fellow said, you know, it used to be when they had a lease sale, I could plan a fishing trip with my son at the same time because it was so regular. It was going to be on this day at this time, happened to be in New Orleans, so they had a great meal. On to say that now there's been dilatory practices that have been instituted, not for the sake of anything other than dilatory and to increase the cost of development and to hopefully thwart that development. Can I get a commitment from you, as much as you can possibly do it, that when we have lease sales now, they will be as they are scheduled to have lease sales, and so the people making these decisions will have certainty as to them?
As someone who was participating in a lawsuit suing the federal government to try to get them to hold the lease sales when they were supposed to be held by law, you can count that as head of Interior, we will be following the law when it comes to lease sale time.
And I think the operative statement is you'll be following the law, and
Yes.
that's a good thing.
Yes.
Now, on that, we know that on some federal lands, from before modern environmental standards, there are abandoned oil and gas wells, and those tend to leak methane, for example. I'm very interested in working on a bipartisan basis, bicameral basis, of how we can actually have a federal program which sustainably is paying to cap these abandoned oil and gas wells. And Louisiana has about 1,500 of them. Any thoughts about that? Because I'm sure in North Dakota that you had to address this issue too.
Well, in North Dakota, we took part of the revenues that were coming into the state from the oil and gas tax revenues, and we created a abandoned well reclamation fund, and that's been replenished, and then that goes back in to do that. But we've also made sure that the private sector is doing their share.
Now, let me ask, because one thing I hear from the private sector is the issue of liability protection. Will they be sued the bejesus out of if something goes bad about this remediation of the abandoned oil and gas well? And I ask this, I don't know the answer to it. We're trying to explore that. There is the abandoned mine provisions that we're looking at. How did y'all manage that in North Dakota?
Well, we always were looking for incentives to make sure that the private sector was willing to participate as opposed to afraid to participate. And you're describing this thing where if you get unlimited liability, then they want to run the other way and lawyer up and do that, as opposed to, hey, if you got the appropriate bond levels that are economic, they pay those up front. We exhaust those. If they've got other payments that they need to do, we've just been able to work collaboratively in a way to make sure that the private sector is doing their share when we're doing this. And part of that, their shares, because we're taking if they weren't investing in creating the well, putting in the people, doing the development, taking the risk on the front end, we wouldn't have the revenue to split up on the back end.
So we're going to look at what y'all did in North Dakota as we draft our legislation. One more thing, knowing that you'll be in charge of this, as I gather, this kind of how do we do energy sort of thing. One thing that I've been concerned about is that countries like China do not enforce international standards on controlling pollution. That lowers their cost of manufacturing as much as 20%, incentivizing manufacturers to leave our country and move there. But then we get the loss of the jobs, but also all the air pollution that then blows over to our West Coast. I think I read 20% of the SOx in California is related to emissions from China. Now, one thing I've been proposing, Senator Graham is my co-sponsor, is a foreign pollution fee that would put a fee on certain products from a country like China roughly equal to their avoided cost of not complying with environmental regulations. As the president speaks about tariffs, this would be a tariff that would be thoroughly defensible as we address something the economists call externalities. I slept in a Holiday Inn last night. I know that word. So I go through that knowing that you and your position will be making sure that our industry is competitive in terms of controlling our emissions in accordance with the law, which then gives us that advantage relative to those competitors arbitraging those rules. Any quick comment on that? Because the chair is being generous and allowing me out a little extra time.
Well, I think you're spot on to recognize President Trump, who has a willingness to use tariffs. His principle is reciprocity. If you have access to our markets, and we don't have access to yours, or if you're using unfair practices, if you're dumping in here, in this case, if they're not doing reclamation, they're using child labor, they're doing all the things that lower their cost, that's exactly the kind of place that he has publicly spoken about, that he would want to have reciprocity with tariffs.
Thank you very much.